One man, 16 million descendants. One in every 200 men alive today may carry his bloodline. That claim appeared in a landmark genetics paper over 20 years ago. It became the most cited statistic in popular genetics. It was printed in textbooks, repeated in documentaries, and shared across the internet millions of times. For over a century, historians believed they understood the scale of this conqueror's legacy. DNA says otherwise, because in 2017, a team re-examined the original data using whole genome sequencing. They concluded that the famous genetic signature does not trace back to one man, it traces back to ordinary warriors. The lineage is roughly 2,500 years old, over 1,000 years before the conqueror was born. And then, in early 2026, another team extracted ancient DNA from the bones of Golden Horde elites buried across the empire. The results complicated the story even further. This is not just the story of one man's genes. It is the story of how a single scientific claim became a modern myth, and what happens when new DNA evidence tears that myth apart. Roughly 800 years ago, a boy was born on the Mongolian steppe. His father was a minor clan chief. His mother had been kidnapped from a rival tribe. Before his 10th birthday, his father was poisoned by enemies. His family was abandoned by their own clan and left to survive alone on the open grassland. He grew up in extreme poverty, hunting marmots and riverfish to stay alive. He was captured and enslaved by a rival group. He escaped. He gathered followers. He fought his way upward through a world of feuding nomadic clans where loyalty shifted with every season and betrayal was the standard tool of advancement. By his early 40s, he had unified every Mongol tribe under a single banner. The scattered herding families of the steppe had become a military machine. In 1206, a council of Mongol leaders proclaimed him supreme ruler. The title meant universal ruler. What followed was the most rapid military expansion in human history. Within 25 years, his armies conquered northern China, destroying a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. They swept through Central Asia, reducing the wealthy cities of the Silk Road to rubble. They crossed into Persia and destroyed its eastern provinces. They reached the borders of Europe. At its peak, the empire he founded covered roughly 24 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, stretching from the Pacific coast of Korea to the fields of Hungary, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The scale of the killing was staggering. Modern historians estimate that the Mongol conquests killed between 30 and 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time. Entire cities were erased. Some regions of Central Asia and Persia did not recover their pre-invasion population levels for centuries. He died in 1227, at roughly 65 years of age. The cause of death is still debated: a fall from a horse, a wound sustained in battle, an illness contracted during his final campaign in China. His body was carried back to Mongolia in secret and buried in an unmarked grave whose location has never been found. His empire did not die with him. His sons and grandsons divided it into 4 great khanates that continued to expand and consolidate for another 2 centuries. The Golden Horde controlled Russia and Eastern Europe. The Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia. The Ilkhanate governed Persia and the Middle East. The Yuan dynasty conquered the rest of China and ruled it for nearly a century. The Mongol postal system, the fastest communication network on Earth at that time, connected these territories across 11,000 kilometers. a message could cross the empire in 2 weeks. Trade routes that had been fractured by centuries of regional warfare were unified under a single authority. Silk, spices, gunpowder, and plague all moved along these roads. The conqueror's personal legacy was not just political, it was biological. Ancient sources describe him maintaining a vast number of wives and concubines, a practice continued by his sons and grandsons across every territory they ruled. His eldest son reportedly had 40 sons. His grandson, who completed the conquest of China, had over 20 wives and countless concubines. 8 centuries later, his grave remains undiscovered. But his genetic legacy, or what scientists believed was his genetic legacy, turned out to be hiding in the bloodstream of millions of living men. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics that would become one of the most famous studies in the history of population genetics. They had analyzed Y chromosome data from over 2,000 men across a vast area stretching from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea. The Y chromosome passes directly from father to son, unchanged, except for occasional mutations. It is the most direct tracer of paternal lineage in the human genome. Within their data, the team identified a single Y chromosome lineage that appeared at remarkably high frequency across the entire former Mongol Empire. Roughly 8% of men in a region stretching from Manchuria to Uzbekistan carried the same distinctive cluster of genetic markers. The team calculated the age of this lineage by counting the mutations that had accumulated along its branches. Their estimate placed the common ancestor of all these men at roughly 1,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The geographic spread matched the borders of the Mongol Empire. The timing matched the conqueror's lifetime. They proposed that this lineage was his direct paternal line. They argued that the extraordinary reproductive advantage enjoyed by the Mongol ruling class, including the conqueror himself, who reportedly had hundreds of wives and concubines across his empire, explained how a single man's Y chromosome could spread to such an extraordinary degree. Extrapolating from the frequency in their sample to the global population, the team estimated that roughly 16 million men alive today carry this lineage. 1 in every 200 men on Earth. The number was staggering. It became a headline. It became a talking point. It became the single most repeated fact in popular genetics. But the study had a problem that almost nobody discussed. The team had no DNA from the conqueror himself. His grave has never been found. No confirmed remains of any direct family member have ever been genetically tested. The identification of the Y chromosome cluster as his lineage was an inference based on timing and geography, not on a direct biological comparison. The logic was this: the lineage expanded rapidly across the Mongol Empire roughly 1,000 years ago. The most powerful man in the Mongol Empire 1,000 years ago was the conqueror. Therefore, this must be his lineage. It was an elegant argument. It was also a guess. For 14 years, the guess was treated as fact. In 2017, a research team based in China published a direct challenge. Their paper appeared in the European Journal of Human Genetics. They sequenced 34 complete Y chromosomes belonging to the famous lineage and its closest relatives. Using whole genome data rather than the limited marker sets available in 2003, they rebuilt the family tree of the lineage with far greater precision. The difference in resolution was enormous. The 2003 study had used 16 short tandem repeat markers. The 2017 study used entire Y chromosome sequences, hundreds of thousands of positions along the chromosome, where the original study saw a single trunk. The new data revealed a complex branching tree with dozens of sublineages that had been invisible at lower resolution. The result overturned the original estimate. The common ancestor of the lineage was not 1,000 years old. It was roughly 2,500 years old, with a confidence interval stretching from roughly 2,000 to over 3,000 years. This placed the origin of the lineage over a millennium before the conqueror was born. The team traced the lineage to either an ancient noble Mongol clan or to ordinary Mongol tribal groups whose expansion across the steppe began centuries before the empire existed. The pattern was consistent with gradual demographic growth over many generations, not the sudden explosive spread that would be expected from a single man's reproductive advantage. The conqueror may still belong to this lineage. He was, after all, a Mongol man from the steppe. But the lineage itself did not begin with him. It was already widespread among Mongol populations long before he united them. The 16 million men do not necessarily descend from one conqueror. They descend from an ancient Mongol paternal line that was already common across the steppe before the empire was even imagined. The 2017 paper was peer-reviewed. It was published in a respected journal. It directly contradicted the most popular genetic claim of the 21st century. Almost nobody noticed. The 16 million number continued to circulate. Documentaries continued to repeat it. Textbooks were not updated. The myth had become self-sustaining, too famous to correct. Then, in early 2026, a new study pushed the story even further. A team published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzing ancient DNA extracted from the bones of Golden Horde elites, the ruling class of the western branch of the Mongol Empire that dominated Russia and Eastern Europe for over 2 centuries. The Golden Horde was founded by the conqueror's grandson, who led Mongol armies into Russia and Hungary in the 1230s. At its peak, it controlled territory from Siberia to the borders of Poland. Its capital on the Volga River was one of the largest cities in the medieval world. The elites buried across this territory were members of the highest ranks of Mongol society. Their graves contained gold ornaments, Chinese silk, and weapons of exceptional quality. These were the men who administered the empire, collected tribute from Russian princes, and maintained the military system that kept the Khanate intact for over 200 years. For the first time, scientists had actual ancient genomes from individuals who lived within the Mongol imperial system, people whose family histories were intertwined with the ruling dynasty. The results confirmed that these individuals carried Y chromosome lineages belonging to the broader family of the famous cluster. But crucially, the ancient genomes showed that the lineage was not a single clean line descending from one man. It was a branching network of related but distinct sublineages, representing multiple elite Mongol families whose Y chromosomes had been spreading independently across Central Asia for centuries. The study concluded that attributing the most common version of the lineage to a single patriarch oversimplifies what was actually a complex process involving many powerful men, many clans, and many generations of expansion. The conqueror may be one branch on the tree, but the tree itself is older, wider, and more complicated than a single origin story allows. This matters because the 16 million claim was never just a number. It became a way of talking about power, about masculinity, about the genetic consequences of violence and conquest. It was used to argue that one man's reproductive success could reshape the genetics of an entire continent. Pop science books cited it as proof that evolution rewards aggression. Social media turned it into a meme. The conqueror became the ultimate alpha male narrative, backed by genetics. The reality is more nuanced, but no less extraordinary. The Mongol expansion did reshape the genetics of Eurasia. Y chromosome lineages associated with Mongol populations did spread across a territory stretching from Korea to Hungary. The reproductive advantage of the ruling class was real, but the advantage did not belong to one man. It belonged to a system, an imperial machine that elevated certain families, granted them access to resources and partners, and sustained their lineages across centuries. The conqueror built that machine. His sons and grandsons operated it for generations after his death. The four great khanates that divided his empire continued to function as engines of genetic spread for over 200 years. The 16 million men alive today who carry this lineage are not the descendants of a single conqueror's bedroom. They are the descendants of an entire ruling class, selected by an empire, sustained by power, and scattered across the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. His grave has never been found. Legend says that a river was diverted over the burial site to hide it permanently. Soldiers who attended the funeral were killed to keep the location secret. A forest was planted over the grave. Horses were driven back and forth across the ground until no trace of disturbed earth remained. For 8 centuries, the location has stayed hidden. The Mongolian government has restricted archaeological access to several suspected sites, partly out of respect and partly out of fear that disturbing the grave would bring misfortune. For over 20 years, scientists believed the Y chromosome cluster told them everything they needed to know about this man's legacy. DNA says otherwise. The cluster is real, the legacy is real, but the simple story of one man fathering 16 million descendants is a myth that science itself created and then spent 2 decades failing to correct. 8 centuries later, his body remains the most sought-after archaeological prize in Central Asia. Satellite surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and aerial photography have all been deployed to find it. Every few years, a team announces a promising lead. None has ever been confirmed. If the grave is ever found, and if DNA can be extracted from the remains, the 20-year debate will end overnight. A single comparison between his Y chromosome and the famous cluster will either confirm or finally disprove the connection. Until then, the question remains open. 16 million men carry a genetic signature that someone roughly 1,000 years ago, or perhaps 2,500 years ago, passed to his sons. Whether that someone was the most famous conqueror in history or an unnamed herder on the steppe a millennium before him is a question that only DNA from an unmarked grave can answer. Somewhere in the Mongolian steppe, under a forest that may have been planted 800 years ago to hide what lies beneath, the bones of the man who built the largest empire in history rest in the dark. His Y chromosome, whatever it turns out to be, is the single most sought-after genetic sample in archaeology. The day that grave is opened, the most popular statistic in genetics will either be confirmed or destroyed in a single sequencing run. For over 20 years, the world believed the question was settled. DNA says otherwise. Discovery continues. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover DNA mysteries, ancient forensics, and the cases history tried to forget.